Hi, this is Andrea Kane, and I'm here with you for HIT 452 Statistics and Analysis. We are on week 1. This is the second video lecture for week 1. It's on chapter 2, which is mathematics review. So get out your pens and paper, or pencils and paper if you prefer, as well as your calculator, because we are going to go back to school for a little bit of a math review, which if we're going to be using formulas, we all probably need. Learning objectives: to calculate using decimals, ratios, proportions, rates, and percentages, to know the difference between a numerator and a denominator, perform rounding with whole numbers and decimals, determine the proper conversion of fractions and decimals to percentages, and compute the average or mean. So let's start with fractions. And this is on page 11. It starts on page 11 in your textbook if you want to follow along. A fraction is one or more parts of the whole. The top number is called the numerator. The bottom number is the denominator. The example they give us here is 3/5. 3 is the numerator, 5 is the denominator, and you pronounce it 3/5. Quotient: the number obtained by dividing the numerator of a fraction by the denominator is a quotient, and it can be expressed in decimals. If you take your handy dandy calculator and you do 3 divided by 5, it gives you 0.6. 0.6 is the quotient. If we are converting this into percentages, just so you know, it would be 60% because it's 6/10. That's the tenth spot. All right, decimal fractions. They're simply referred to as decimals. In the decimal number 14.37, the digits 3 and 7 are called decimal digits. Anything to the right of the decimal point are called decimal digits. The decimal point is merely a way of separating the whole number, the 14, from the fraction part, which is 0.37. And if you remember back from school, this first spot after the decimal is tens, and this is hundreds, and the next one would be thousands. So mentally, you should be thinking this is 14/37 out of 100. Okay, so if we turn this back into a fraction, it would be 14/37 over 100. So there's 14 whole parts plus 30.37 fraction parts. And you always want to use the leading zero before the decimal point. In medicine, you always do that. You never ever leave it with just the point. You always use the 0.5. And so this is what I was talking about, how you have your tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s. And over here you have your tens, hundreds, or I'm sorry, yeah, your ones, your tens, your hundreds, and your thousands. So make sure that you are familiar with this. Rounding, whole numbers, how do we do that? It's approximating a number. So one way is to round the number to the nearest 10 or 100. So if we have the number 31 and it's between 30 and 40, we say it's closer to 30 if you round it. And 5 is usually the number that if it's 5, you go up. If it's less than 5, you go down. So if we had the number 34, we would still round down to 30. If we have the number 35, we would round up to 40. So keep that in mind. Anything that's 5 and up goes up. Anything that's 4, that's less than 5. Anything that's less than 5 goes down. And that's basically what they're explaining down here. Nearest 100 is just simply moving it up so that you're looking at this the first 2 decimal places after the decimal. So 327 is between 300 and 400, but 327 is less than 350, so it goes down to 300. If this were 377, it would go up to 400 because it would be 350 or above. And the same thing when you go to thousands. So that's what it talks about here. And then this looks at the thousands. Again, you have 3. So 7337 would be rounded down to 7,000. but 7537 would be rounded up to 8,000. And they give you some more examples here. Decimals. Okay, so let's talk about decimals. If you have 14.4, again, it's less than that 5, you're going to round it down to 14. But if you have 5 here, you're going to round it up to 15. And that's where they talk about. And yes, most healthcare statistics are reported as decimals. They'll either use 1 decimal place or 2 decimal places, typically. Well, what happens if you have 14.46 and they tell you that you can only have 1 decimal place? That's where we start getting into rounding using decimal places. So if you have 14.46, this is going to turn into 14.5. If you have 14.13, that's going to turn into 14.1 because that 3 is less than 5. And this 6 is more than 5. So that's how it shows you where to go. Percentages. The ratio of a part to the whole is often expressed as a percentage. And this is a fraction that's expressed in hundredths. Make sure you remember that. It's always over 100. So it's always going to be 2 places. So down here, this is 12.5%. You always divide it here. You have, this is your percentage. So that's how they get there. You move that 2 places so that you got it over the 100. Changing a fraction to a percentage. Okay, well, if you have a fraction and they give us 1/2, it's 1 divided by 2, that equals 0.5. That 0.5 you have to multiply by 100 because you need to convert it to per 100. So when you do that, you have 0.5 times 100, that's 50%. For me, it's just easier to move this decimal point 2 spots. Whoops, sorry, let me go back. For me, it's just easier to move it 2 spots. So since you don't have anything here, it's a 0. So when you move it your 2 spots, you've got 50%. It's just easier for me than multiplying it out. But you can do that with your calculator too, as long as you get it to the right place. So let's say you have 0.29. Again, you're going to move that decimal 2 places to get to a percentage, and that's going to give you your percent. Or you can multiply it by 100, whichever you want to do. How do you change a percentage to a fraction? You've got 5%. Well, you take 5, you multiply it by 1 divided by 100. Well, that's going to give you 5 divided by 100. So trying to think of an easy way here. Take your percentage and multiply it by 1. So if we had 50%, this would be 50 here instead of 5. If this was 50%, this would be 50 out of 100. And then it talks about converting them to their simplest form. I really wouldn't worry a whole lot about that because that's not something we use a whole lot in the real world, but just know that you can divide that and it results in a fraction of 1 out of 20 or 1/20th. How do you eliminate the percent sign and place a decimal point? Well, if you've got 76%, move that decimal back 2, and that will give you the decimal number of a percentage. So move it back by 2. And if you have 4% and you move it back by 2, you have to put in that 0. Calculating ratios. A ratio expresses the relationship of one quantity to another. It's calculated by dividing, sorry, my mouse gets a little crazy here. The ratio is calculated by dividing one quantity by another. The number can be greater than 1 or less than 1. So for instance, if we have 7 men and 5 women in a group, the ratio of men to women would be 7 to 5. And typically it's written as 7:5. And it's pronounced 7 to 5. Typically, you want to simplify those to the simplest form. So let's say there's 6 men to 10 women. That's the ratio, 6 to 10. Can either be divided by a common factor. Yes, 2 fits both. You divide them by 2 and you end up with 3 to 5. So rather than 6 to 10, you need to divide it down to get 3 to 5, to get it to the simplest one. Proportion is a ratio where the x is a proportion of the whole, x plus y. And you may remember this from some algebra days or pre-algebra days. In a proportion, the numerator is always included in the denominator. Okay, this is proportion. Remember, proportion, you've got the numerator in the denominator. So if 2 women out of a group of 10 over the age of 50 have had cancer, x is going to equal 2, the women that have had cancer. Y equals 8, which is the women who do not have cancer. The calculation would be 2 divided by 2 plus 8, which is 0.2. So the proportion of women that have cancer is 0.2. Do you see how they're doing that? You have to have that 2 in the numerator and the denominator. Rate. A rate is a ratio in which there's a distinct relationship between the numerator and denominator, and the denominator often implies a large base population. Measure of time can be an intrinsic part of the denominator, and you need to make sure you pay attention with rates and percentages, because it's very easy to misplace decimal points. Very, very easy. So make sure you're being really careful when you're moving decimals. The term rate is often used loosely to refer to rate, proportion, percentage, and ratio. And so it gets confusing. Quite honestly, it gets confusing. Rate can mean rate, proportion, percentage, ratio. You really have to read and understand the context that it is. How do you calculate a rate? The basic rule of thumb for calculating rate is to indicate the number of times that something actually happened in relation to the number of times that it could have happened. So it's actual divided by potential. So the rate is going to be the part or base, or part divided by the base. So rate is the part divided by the base, or rate is the actual divided by the potential. And remember, the actual is also included in the potential. We just covered that when you go back here where it talks about proportion, because remember, rate and proportion are the same thing. Averages. An average is the value obtained by dividing the sum of a set of numbers by the number of values. This is also the mean. So in your mind, average equals mean. I'm going to stop here really quick and tell you this whole PowerPoint you have got to know. You have got to know what average is. You've got to know that average and mean are the same thing. You've got to know what proportion is, and that rate and proportion are the same thing, and what is included in those, and what is that formula. You'll need to know what is a ratio, what's a numerator, what's a denominator. All those things you're going to need for your quiz. Okay, so getting back to averages. It gives you an example here. If the student took 6 tests in a particular class and the scores are as listed, you add those all together. They equal 486. Now you're going to divide them by the number, which is 6, because there were 6 tests. So you add up 82 plus 78 plus 94 plus 56 plus 91 plus 85 equals 486. 486 divided by 6 is 81. So the average score of all those 6 tests is 81. You need to know this. Really, really, truly. All right, so that is the end. May I just say that it drives me crazy with these slides from Mahima when they don't put page numbers on them. I find them ending before I expected to. Not that that's a bad thing, it just happens that way. All right, so chapter 2, make sure you go through and you do the exercises and you check your work and you get really friendly with your calculator and you get really comfortable with working things out on paper. Make sure you're comfortable with rounding. Even though chapter 2 seems like you're going back to elementary school, it's so foundational, because as we get into these formulas, knowing whether you round up or down, knowing whether you're using 1 decimal place or 2 or 3, how to turn it into a percentage. Those are all going to be critical to you. All right, that's all I've got for this week. Take care. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye.